My name is Iris Palmer. I am 21 years old and I study actuarial science, which is a quiet way of saying I calculate the exact probability of disasters. On the morning of my 21st birthday, the disaster sat across from me in a mahogany conference room in Madison, Wisconsin. My mother, Diane, slid a formal legal document across the table. It was an unsecured promissory note claiming I had borrowed $250,000 from her catering business. The terms directed my late father's entire educational trust to be drained into her accounts immediately to settle the fake debt. She handed me a silver pen and smiled the warm practice smile she used to charm the country club board. I did not yell. I did not throw the pen. I simply read the 3 pages, set my father's vintage financial calculator on the table, and prepared to ask the one mathematical question that would turn her pristine fraud into a felony. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where quiet women refuse to pay the ransom, and family secrets are audited in the daylight. If you have ever been the daughter expected to fund someone else's lies, you are in the right place. Drop a comment letting me know what age you are and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up 20 minutes because the trap was set long before the pen was offered. The trust department at Madison First National Bank smelled like lemon polish and old paper. It was a room built for serious men doing serious math. The wainscoting was dark and heavy, and the tall windows looked out over the gray, windswept surface of Lake Monona. My mother sat on the opposite side of the table with her coat draped neatly over the back of her chair. Diane Palmer ran the most successful upscale catering company in Dane County. She treated our Midwestern community standing like a currency she was constantly hoarding. Her posture was unyielding, the physical habit of a woman who had spent her youth competing for crowns in county fairs. Beside her sat Brenda. Brenda was a local notary public who had known our family since I was in grade school. Normally, Brenda was a talkative woman who baked zucchini bread for the church auctions, but today she kept wiping her palms on her wool skirt. Her fingers were wrapped tight around a leather-bound logbook. She would not meet my eyes. I sat down and unzipped my canvas messenger bag. I did not pull out a pen. I reached in and took out my father's HP 12C financial calculator. It is a dense black rectangle with faded gold lettering above the keys. My dad taught me how to run amortization schedules on it when I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while my mother was out networking. Placing it on the polished wood was my way of bringing him into the room. Diane tapped her manicured fingernail against the thick ivory paper resting between us. "It is just a standard adjustment, Iris," she said. Her voice dropped into a register of practiced maternal concern. "We need to clear the internal accounts before the executor comes in to release the main disbursement. You want the family business to stay healthy, right?" "Family protects family, sweetheart." I pulled the document toward me. Actuaries do not look at the narrative first. We look at the baseline data. The header declared it a debt acknowledgement. The clauses were written in dense legalese, but the arithmetic was brutal. It wiped out the trust my father spent his life building to protect my future, transferring every cent to Palmer Catering. I turned to the last page. My signature sat on the bottom line. It was an exceptional forgery. The slant was correct. The loop of the P had the slight flat edge I developed after breaking my wrist playing softball in high school. My mother had clearly practiced the mechanics of my handwriting until her muscle memory matched mine. But she had made one structural error. It is the kind of error that happens when you operate on arrogance instead of data. Next to my fake signature was Brenda's official state notary seal. It was stamped in crisp purple ink, the Wisconsin state emblem, perfectly aligned. The block of text beneath it certified under penalty of perjury that Brenda had physically witnessed me signing this document on October 14th of the previous year. I looked at Brenda. Her eyes darted away, fixing on the brass lamp in the corner of the office. In our town, we are raised on a strict diet of polite smiles, community trust, and unspoken rules. You do not embarrass your parents in public. You do not accuse a respected local business owner of theft. You swallow the loss, keep your head down, and maintain the integrity of the family name. Diane was counting on that cultural gag order. She bet my inheritance that I would be too intimidated by the formal banking setting and the social pressure to make a scene. She expected me to behave like a compliant daughter. She forgot she raised an actuary. I rested my hand flat on the cold mahogany table next to the forged contract. My pulse was steady. I looked at the date in purple ink. Then I looked at my mother's flawless, expectant smile, and I calculated the exact velocity it would take to bring her entire world crashing down. To understand why sitting in that bank looking at my stolen signature did not make my pulse race, you need to understand the basic arithmetic of my childhood. I grew up in a town where family integrity is treated like a religion, and honest labor is the only currency that matters. In a tight-knit Wisconsin community like ours, if you show up early, sponsor the local Little League team, and host the annual Rotary Club dinner, your reputation becomes bulletproof. People trust the performance of hard work more than they trust their own eyes. My mother understood this better than anyone. Diane built Palmer Catering into a local empire by selling the illusion of Midwestern perfection. She provided the food for every country club gala, every high society wedding, and every charity auction in the county. From the outside, our family looked like a flawless painting, but behind the swinging doors of the commercial kitchen, the truth was just an exercise in risk management. My mother operated on the principle that appearances could overwrite reality. If the presentation was beautiful, nobody would notice if the foundation was rotting. She divided her daughters according to this philosophy. My older sister Kelsey was the presentation layer. Kelsey was groomed from birth to be the social face of the brand. She inherited my mother's pageant smile and her effortless ability to command a room. Diane treated Kelsey like a luxury marketing expense. She sent her to etiquette classes, bought her a membership to the tennis club, and paraded her through the dining room during high-profile events. Kelsey learned early that her value was tied directly to her aesthetic yield. There was always money for Kelsey to have the right designer dresses and the expensive car leases that signaled success to the neighbors. She was an investment that paid dividends in social capital. I was the unmeasured variable. I did not inherit the pageant smile, and I had no interest in charming the local elite. So Diane assigned me to the back office. While Kelsey was out front shaking hands and securing deposits, I spent my teenage years in the walk-in freezer doing inventory. I tallied the cost of saffron, calculated the depreciation of the delivery vans, and balanced the catering invoices. I saw the raw numbers behind the flawless execution. I knew how often Diane delayed paying the wholesale produce vendors so she could afford new silk table runners. I watched the accounts payable columns swell while the profit margins shrank into single digits. Diane found me useful, but she also found me invisible. In her economy, you were only valuable if you could be put on display. I was the silent labor that kept the lights on the daughter who required no investment and yielded a steady, uncomplaining return. My only sanctuary from the catering facade was my father. David Palmer was a quiet man who saw the world in tables, trends, and probabilities. He worked as an actuary for a regional insurance firm, spending his days assessing risk and calculating life expectancies. He was the one who gave me the financial calculator. He taught me that while people will lie to you with their words and their smiles, numbers have no agenda. A mortality table does not care about your social standing. An amortization schedule does not alter its trajectory because you smile at the bank teller. He taught me to seek comfort in the rigid, unforgiving honesty of mathematics. I remember sitting at the kitchen table on late autumn evenings, the smell of roasted garlic and industrial degreaser clinging to my clothes from my shift in the catering kitchen. My father would slide a sheet of graph paper across the table and show me how to map risk distribution. He taught me that anomalies in data are rarely mistakes. They are usually warnings. He showed me how to read the true health of a system, not by looking at its peak, but by examining its margins. If a catering business looks prosperous in the dining room, but cannot meet its payroll tax obligations in the back office, the dining room is a lie. My father understood exactly who his wife was. He loved her, perhaps in the way one loves a destructive force of nature, but he did not trust her with the future. He knew that Diane viewed money as a spotlight, a tool to buy community standing and maintain her flawless image. He knew that if he left his assets unprotected, she would burn through them to keep the stage illuminated. When I was 16, his health began to fail. It was a quiet, persistent illness that defied the odds on all his life tables. Before he passed away, he pulled me aside and handed me a thick manila folder. Inside was the documentation for an educational trust. He had funneled every spare dollar he earned into a protected account locked behind a legal firewall that named an independent executor. It was drafted by a meticulous estate lawyer and governed by strict fiduciary statutes. The terms were rigid and mathematically precise. The funds could only be released to me directly upon my 21st birthday. He built that trust as a bunker. It was the one asset my mother could not leverage borrow against or spend on Kelsey's social climbing. When my father died, Diane treated his passing not just as a tragedy, but as a public relations event. She accepted the community's casseroles and condolences with the stoic grace of a grieving widow. She wore her tailored black suits to the grocery store and allowed the town to marvel at her strength. She spun his death into a narrative of perseverance, a brave mother holding the family business together against all odds, cementing her status as a local martyr. But behind closed doors, her grief was sharp and erratic. The discovery of the locked trust enraged her. She viewed my financial independence as a direct threat to her controlled narrative. In her mind, every asset in the family belonged to the catering empire. Diane demanded consolidation. She wanted every resource pooled under her name, subject to her discretion. The fact that I held a separate, untouchable reserve made me a liability on her balance sheet. Over the years, she tried countless strategies to bring me back under her control. She used emotional manipulation, attempting to guilt me for leaving the family business when I moved away to study actuarial science at the university. She told our neighbors that she was so worried about me planting the seed, that I was struggling without my father, that I was a troubled girl making reckless choices. She weaponized the community's trust, hoarding their sympathy like capital. She knew that in a town built on family loyalty, a daughter who distances herself from a hardworking widowed mother is automatically viewed with suspicion. It was a brilliant preemptive mitigation strategy. By painting me as a fragile, unpredictable variable, she ensured that if I ever tried to expose her financial reality, the community would dismiss my claims as the ramblings of a troubled child. I watched her operate the same way I watched a risk model simulate a disaster. I did not argue with her. I did not defend myself to the neighbors who gave me sad, pitying looks at the grocery store. I applied the principles my father taught me. I calculated the probabilities. I mapped her behavior. Diane operated purely on appearances, using her reputation as a shield. I approached life through actuarial science, relying on cold, unshakable logic. She thought my silence meant I was intimidated. She mistook my refusal to participate in her drama for weakness. But I was simply doing the math. I knew that the catering business was a hollow structure. I knew that Kelsey's lifestyle was a drain the company could not sustain. And I knew with statistical certainty that as my 21st birthday approached, Diane would grow desperate. The trust was the only liquid asset left in our family. It was $250,000 sitting just out of her reach, protected only by a calendar date and my signature. A woman who builds her entire life on a facade will do anything to stop the curtain from falling. I always knew my mother would try to access the trust. The probability of her letting that money vest to me was 0. I did not know the exact mechanism she would use. I did not know if she would try to declare me incompetent, if she would attempt to manipulate the executor, or if she would resort to outright fraud. So, I spent my college years preparing. I kept my head down, I maintained the baseline data of my own life, and I waited in the dark. I just had to wait for the system to show a crack, for the anomaly to appear in the trend line, to see exactly what kind of crime my mother would engineer. The warning sign did not arrive with a scream or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly 6 months before my birthday, in the form of a missing piece of mail. 6 months before I sat in that mahogany bank office, the first baseline anomaly appeared. In the world of risk assessment, a sudden deviation in a long-standing pattern is never a coincidence. It is an early warning system. Actuaries rely on the strict integrity of reporting cycles to predict future outcomes. For 4 years, my quarterly trust statements had arrived on the second Tuesday of January, April, July, and October. They came in heavy cream envelopes stamped with the return address of the Madison fiduciary. I never needed to open them to know the balance. The growth was steady, governed by conservative index funds my father had meticulously selected before his passing. But the physical arrival of the envelope was a constant metric. It was tangible proof that the firewall holding my future was still intact. April arrived. The snow melted into muddy slush across the Wisconsin fields, and the second Tuesday brought nothing but utility bills and glossy catalogs. Wednesday passed. Thursday brought the same empty result. A typical person might ask their mother if she had seen the mail. A typical daughter might call the bank, raise a fuss, or complain about postal delays to the local clerk. I did none of those things. When a critical data point vanishes, you do not alert the system that you are looking for it. Doing so only teaches the system to hide its tracks better. You stay quiet. You observe the environment. You find out who is controlling the flow of information. I adjusted my university study schedule that week, ensuring I was sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop open every day at noon. That was exactly when the postal carrier's truck hummed up our long gravel driveway. My mother was usually in her catering office downtown during those hours, managing her staff and booking lucrative summer weddings. Suddenly, she was finding reasons to come home for lunch. She would sweep through the front door, her designer heels clicking a sharp, hurried rhythm against the hardwood floor. I watched her through the reflection of the stainless steel microwave. She intercepted the mail directly from the carrier before it even hit the metal box by the street. She stood on the porch, sorting through the stack with practiced, ruthless efficiency. Most of the envelopes went straight into her leather tote bag. Only a curated selection made it to the kitchen counter. I kept my eyes locked on my statistics homework. She breezed into the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune, and set a pile of local grocery flyers down next to my elbow. She asked about my classes, offered to make me a sandwich, and projected the aura of a dedicated, supportive parent taking a midday break to check on her youngest child. Her performance was flawless. She played the part of the nurturing Midwestern mother to perfection, wrapped in cashmere and smelling of expensive perfume. But her tote bag was a mobile vault containing my stolen correspondence. She was not just misplacing my letters. She was actively constructing an information blockade. She wanted me isolated from my own financial reality. I needed to know the motive behind the blockade. If she was hiding the statements, she was trying to blind me to the account's approaching maturity date. I retreated to my campus apartment that evening, locked the deadbolt, and opened a new browser window. Actuarial training teaches you that private secrets always leave public footprints if you know where to look. I bypassed social media and went straight to the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions portal. I searched the corporate registry and the county clerk databases for Palmer Catering. Our town viewed my mother as a titan of local industry. She drove a pristine imported SUV, wore silk blouses to the grocery store, and sponsored the high school debate team. The community saw a thriving empire built on hard work and impeccable taste. They saw a widow who had bravely kept her husband's legacy alive through sheer Midwestern grit. The public records told a chillingly different story. The ledger was a horror show of toxic leverage. I pulled up the Uniform Commercial Code filings. Palmer Catering was drowning in obligations. Traditional banks require rigorous audits, and it was clear from the filings that the local banks had cut her off long ago. Over the past 3 years, Diane had executed a series of merchant cash advances. These were not standard respectable small business loans from the local credit union. They were predatory short-term financial instruments designed to extract capital at ruinous daily rates. She had leveraged the commercial kitchen equipment, the delivery vans, and the future receivables of her most lucrative catering contracts. I reached into my bag, pulled out my father's financial calculator, and ran the amortization formulas. The math was unyielding. The business was technically insolvent. The revenue from the country club galas and charity dinners was barely covering the interest payments on the crushing debt load. Diane was running a highly sophisticated, deeply desperate shell game. She was paying yesterday's lenders with tomorrow's catering deposits. Every grand event she catered was just a mechanism to service the debt from the event before it. I sat back in my chair and watched the cursor blink against the harsh white glare of the screen. The financial facade was crumbling, yet Diane and my older sister Kelsey were still living like royalty. They were still planning expensive weekend trips, upgrading their wardrobes with seasonal designer pieces, and hosting lavish dinners that cost more than my monthly rent. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening click. Diane was not just hiding my mail to keep me ignorant. She was looking at the calendar. My 21st birthday was exactly 6 months away. My father's trust was scheduled to vest, liquidating $250,000 directly into my name, free and clear of any parental oversight. In my mother's mind, that money was not my inheritance. It was her guaranteed bailout fund. She was keeping the business afloat on toxic debt because she fully intended to use my trust to clear the ledger before the lenders foreclosed on her ovens and delivery trucks. She was buying time with borrowed money, treating my future as her collateral. She viewed my financial independence as an asset she could seize to balance her own ruined books. The missing mail was not a petty theft. It was the preliminary phase of a financial crime being actively plotted under my own roof. Diane was engineering a trap, and she needed me deaf and blind until the mechanism was ready to snap shut. She needed me to walk into my 21st birthday believing the family was prosperous and secure. I turned off my laptop, the screen going black, leaving me in the quiet darkness of my apartment. I knew the business was bleeding out, but I still needed to pinpoint the exact wound. I needed to know where all that borrowed money was going because the catering company itself did not show the upgrades or expansions that would justify such steep borrowing. The answer to that question would soon present itself wearing designer shoes and carrying a price tag that defied all logic. To understand where a hemorrhaging business loses its capital, you must track the unrecorded liabilities. Palmer Catering generated steady revenue, yet the commercial accounts always hovered near zero. The discrepancy gnawed at my statistical models until I drove home for a weekend visit and parked my tired sedan next to the physical answer. A brand new pearl white imported sports utility vehicle sat in our driveway, the dealership tags still gleaming in the afternoon sun. That vehicle belonged to my older sister. Kelsey had never worked a single shift in the catering kitchen. Her occupation was existing as a flawless extension of my mother's brand. She was the walking, talking billboard for our family's supposed prosperity. Kelsey was 25 and engaged to the son of a prominent local orthodontist. In our community, a marriage like that was not merely a romantic union. It was a merger of social capital. Diane viewed the upcoming nuptials as the ultimate showcase of her own success, a coronation that would secure her status at the pinnacle of town society forever. To fund this ascension, my mother treated her business revenue like a personal slush fund. She siphoned working capital away from payroll accounts and vendor invoices to underwrite Kelsey's country club membership, her seasonal wardrobe rotations, and her luxury vehicle leases. I walked through the front door and found them at the kitchen island. The marble countertop was buried under a snowstorm of glossy bridal magazines, silk fabric swatches, and thick vellum invitation samples. My mother stood holding a magnifying glass over a floral catalog, while Kelsey scrolled through her smartphone with a bored, manicured thumb. I quietly set my backpack on the floor and took a seat on the far stool. They barely registered my arrival. I was just the background noise in their grand production. "Look at the cascading orchids," Diane murmured, tapping the glossy page. "We can drape them over the grand staircase at the club. It creates a stunning visual for the photographer when you make your entrance." Kelsey sighed, twirling a heavy diamond ring around her finger. "Are you sure we can swing the imported ones? The florist said the domestic lilies are more affordable, and honestly, no one will notice the difference after 3 cocktails. Diane stiffened. Her posture went rigid. We are not cutting corners on the floral arrangements, Kelsey. People notice. The Wilkinsons used domestic lilies at their daughter's reception last spring, and the petals browned before the cake was cut. We are projecting abundance. I will handle the florist. I sat there calculating the exact cost of that abundance. Imported orchids for a staircase of that size, plus the centerpieces. The bridal bouquets and the boutonnieres would easily eclipse the cost of my entire junior year tuition. It was a staggering misallocation of resources. Diane was financing perishable commodities with predatory merchant cash advances carrying ruinous interest rates. Every single petal in that arrangement was bought on toxic credit. Kelsey tossed her phone onto the marble and stretched her arms above her head. Well, I leave the magic to you. She laughed a bright, careless sound. Mom always finds a way to pay for it. I watched my sister smile. In the discipline of risk management, we call that a subscription to ignorance. Kelsey was not naive. She possessed a functioning brain. She saw the stress lines bracketing our mother's mouth. She noticed the frantic phone calls from creditors Diane tried to muffle behind the closed office door. But Kelsey actively chose not to comprehend the math. Acknowledging the financial rot would require her to surrender the imported vehicle, the designer shoes, and the lavish wedding, so she outsourced her conscience to Diane. Kelsey was the leak. Diane was the failing dam. And neither of them was willing to stop the water from rising. I sat perfectly still, observing them operate like a sunk cost fallacy in real time. A sunk cost fallacy occurs when an entity continues to invest heavily in a failing endeavor simply because they have already poured immense resources into it. Diane had spent her entire adult life grooming Kelsey for this exact social triumph. To scale back the wedding now, to admit they could not afford the orchids or the country club venue, would mean acknowledging that the last 2 decades of social climbing were a hollow failure. Diane would rather bankrupt herself than face that humiliation. The terrifying part was the realization that she was not just bankrupting herself. As I watched Diane circle a 6-figure catering package in the bridal binder, the final piece of the puzzle locked into place. The merchant cash advances were maximized. The equipment was fully leveraged. The catering business had zero liquidity left. There was only one pool of uncontaminated capital remaining in our entire family structure. My father's educational trust. Diane was not signing these ruinous floral contracts with the hope that a sudden windfall would save her. She was signing them because she had already mentally allocated my inheritance to clear the ledger. She viewed my 21st birthday as her ultimate maturity date. The $250,000 meant for my future was already spent in her mind, transformed into cascading orchids, silk tablecloths, and the validation of her country club peers. I did not betray a single emotion. I did not confront them about the sheer insanity of spending a mortgage down payment on a single afternoon of appetizers and music. I kept my face as blank as a fresh spreadsheet. Screaming would only trigger their defensive protocols. I needed to remain the invisible, compliant background variable. The kitchen grew quiet as Kelsey gathered her purse and her keys, kissing Diane on the cheek before floating out the front door to meet her fiancé for a tasting menu. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving just my mother and me in the large, pristine space. Diane slowly closed the floral catalog. She gathered the fabric swatches and stacked them into a neat, precise pile. The frantic energy she carried while Kelsey was in the room dissipated, replaced by a cold, assessing stillness. She looked across the kitchen island at me. Her eyes were hard and calculating, devoid of the maternal warmth she performed for the public. She knew I was observant. She knew my father had taught me how to read numbers. She did not know exactly how much I had uncovered, but she sensed that I was not participating in the shared delusion. "Family protects family, Iris," she said. The words dropped into the quiet kitchen like stones hitting a tile floor. Her voice was flat, carrying no affection, only the heavy weight of an obligation. "You will understand that when you are older. Some sacrifices have to be made to keep the foundation strong." It was not a lesson in morality. It was a threat. It was the preamble to theft. She was laying the psychological groundwork to justify robbing me. She was telling me that when the time came, I was expected to surrender my future to preserve their illusion. and that any resistance on my part would be framed as a betrayal of our blood. I nodded slowly, offering her a polite, vacant smile. "I understand, Mom." She turned back to her wedding binders, satisfied that the unmeasured variable had been neutralized. She had no idea that I was already designing the architecture of her ruin. She thought she was building a cage for me, but she was merely handing me the tools to dismantle her own. Every dollar she committed to that wedding was another piece of evidence I would eventually use against her. The trap was set, but it was not mine. It was hers, and she was walking into it willingly. The execution of a financial trap requires more than just forged documents and hidden ledger entries. It requires a favorable operating environment. In the realm of actuarial science, we call this environmental risk smoothing. If you know a storm is going to wipe out a coastal property, you do not just falsify the structural integrity reports. You convince the zoning board that the property was always a hazard, so when the collapse happens, nobody questions the wreckage. Diane understood this principle intuitively. She knew that stealing $250,000 from her own daughter would eventually generate noise. To ensure that noise was never interpreted as a crime, she needed to predetermine how the town would hear it. She needed to weaponize the community against me. In a Midwestern town, destruction does not arrive with drawn weapons or shouted threats. It arrives wrapped in aluminum foil and delivered with a sympathetic sigh. Gossip is an intricate, highly regulated currency. It is traded under the guise of prayer requests, shared over the rims of coffee cups at morning charity committee meetings, and whispered in the aisles of the local grocery store. Diane was a master of this exchange. She possessed decades of accumulated social capital, and she spent it with ruthless precision. The campaign began quietly during the annual spring bake sale at the First Presbyterian Church. I was home for the weekend, sitting near the periphery of the fellowship hall, organizing a stack of napkins. From my vantage point, I could watch my mother hold court. She wore a modest pearl necklace and a tailored navy dress, projecting the image of a pillar of the community holding firm under immense personal strain. I watched her pull Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, aside near the coffee urn. Diane tilted her head, her voice dropping into a register of profound maternal sorrow. I could not hear the exact words, but I could read the physical mechanics of the conversation. Diane touched her own chest. She shook her head slowly, looking down at the linoleum floor. Mrs. Gable reached out and patted my mother on the forearm, her face contorting into a mask of deep pity. Diane looked over at me, a lingering, tragic glance, and then whispered something else into Mrs. Gable's ear. Within 48 hours, the ambient temperature of my hometown shifted. I walked into the local pharmacy to pick up toothpaste and encountered the initial wave of the fallout. The pharmacist, a man who had given me lollipops when I was 7, handed me my receipt with a tight, uncomfortable grimace. He did not ask how my university classes were going, which was his usual routine. Instead, he told me that these years can be turbulent and that I should remember how much my mother sacrificed to keep a roof over my head. The interactions escalated from subtle discomfort to overt condescension. Later that week, I attended a Rotary Club breakfast that Diane insisted I sit through to support the catering staff. I stood by the buffet line holding a stack of ceramic plates. Mrs. Gable approached me smelling of floral soap and quiet judgment. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip uncomfortably tight. "Iris," she murmured, her tone dripping with unearned intimacy. "We are all keeping you in our thoughts. Grief makes young people do unpredictable things. Your mother is carrying such a heavy burden trying to keep the business afloat without your father. Please tell me you are being careful with your tuition money. We hear things have been quite reckless lately." I stood there holding the cold ceramic plates. The narrative was crystal clear. Diane had planted the seed that I was unraveling. She had painted a picture of a grieving, unstable college student who was squandering her resources and behaving erratically. She was laying the psychological groundwork for the moment my trust fund vanished. By framing me as a financial liability, Diane achieved 2 critical objectives. First, she created a plausible excuse for why she might need to suddenly step in and take control of my assets. She was telling the town that she was intervening to save me from myself. Second, she established a preemptive defense against any future accusations I might make. If a troubled, reckless daughter suddenly runs into the town square, screaming that her devoted, hard-working mother stole her inheritance, the town will not call the police. They will call a therapist. They will view the accusation as the tragic delusion of a spiraling child lashing out at her only caregiver. Diane was immunizing herself against my future testimony. She was destroying my credibility before I even knew I was on trial. The isolation was swift and suffocating. People I had known my entire life began treating me like a fragile, unpredictable explosive. Neighbors offered me unsolicited advice about budgeting and honoring my family obligations. Old high school teachers gave me sad, knowing smiles. Even Kelsey leaned into the narrative. During a family dinner, she casually mentioned that I looked exhausted and suggested I should let Mom handle my apartment lease negotiations because I clearly could not handle the stress of adult responsibilities. A typical target of a smear campaign would fight back. They would loudly defend their honor post rebuttals on social media or confront the gossips in the grocery store aisles. They would demand justice and demand to be heard, but I knew that responding with outrage would only validate Diane's narrative. If I raised my voice, I would be the hysterical child she claimed I was. If I argued with the pastor's wife, I would be the disrespectful, erratic daughter lashing out at innocent concern. Defending myself would only tighten the snare. Actuarial science teaches you that you cannot argue with a trend line using emotion. You can only defeat bad data with unassailable data. I accepted the social exile. I let them believe the lie. When Mrs. Gable offered her condescending advice, I smiled politely, thanked her for her concern, and walked away. When neighbors looked at me with pity, I maintained a blank, pleasant expression. I allowed Diane to build her fictional reality where she was the savior, and I was the sinking ship. I retreated into the background, becoming a ghost in my own hometown. This strategic retreat served a vital purpose. It gave Diane a false sense of absolute security. Believing that her public relations blockade was impenetrable, she became sloppy in her operational security. She assumed that because the town was deaf to me, I was also blind to her. She did not realize that by stripping away my social support network, she had freed me from any lingering obligation to protect her reputation. She had severed the emotional tethers that usually keep a family bound together. I no longer had to worry about what the neighbors would think because the neighbors had already decided who I was. I packed my bags and returned to my campus apartment, leaving the toxic theater of my hometown behind. I sat at my desk looking at my father's financial calculator. The social battlefield was lost, but the documentary battlefield was pristine. Diane could control the whispers at the church bake sale, but she could not control the digital footprints of a merchant cash advance. She could manipulate the pastor's wife, but she could not manipulate a time-stamped university exam log. I poured a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. The time for monitoring the perimeter was over. I needed to move from risk assessment to forensic extraction. I needed to find the exact mechanism she intended to use to breach the trust. I knew she was planning a theft, and I knew she had primed the audience to ignore it. Now I just had to catch her hands in the machinery. The answer to how she planned to execute the fraud was waiting for me left behind on a glass scanner pane in the quiet hours of the night. The isolation my mother manufactured became my greatest advantage, because I had retreated into the background of our hometown. Diane stopped perceiving me as a threat. I was no longer an opponent in her mind. I was simply a piece of furniture in the catering office, a silent variable that swept the floors and tallied the linen invoices after hours. It was late October, and the Wisconsin autumn had stripped the trees bare. The catering headquarters occupied a converted brick warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The air inside always carried the faint scent of bleached stale coffee and baked sugar. Diane preferred to leave the unglamorous closing duties to me. She would depart around 5 o'clock to attend evening mixers or charity planning committees, leaving a trail of unwashed tasting plates and scattered vendor files in her wake. My task was to sanitize the workspace and shut down the equipment. My father used to say that people reveal their true nature in the messes they leave behind for others to clean. He was referring to corporate negligence, but the principle applied perfectly to my mother. It was near midnight. The warehouse was quiet save for the low hum of the commercial refrigerators in the adjacent kitchen. I moved into Diane's personal office to power down her workstation. Her desk was an island of polished cherry wood buried under a chaos of wedding itineraries and past due notices. Behind the desk sat a heavy industrial copy machine that doubled as a high-capacity scanner. A single green light blinked on its display panel, indicating an active job that had timed out. I reached over to press the power button. As I leaned across the machine, I noticed the heavy plastic lid was slightly ajar. A piece of white printer paper rested crookedly on the glass platen. I lifted the lid. The breath stopped in my throat. It was a piece of standard office stationery. The page was covered in ink. It was not a catering invoice or a floral contract. It was my name. Iris Palmer. Over and over again. The first few attempts at the top of the page were shaky and uneven. The cursive looped too high, the pressure too heavy. But as my eyes tracked down the sheet, the handwriting evolved. The slant sharpened. The spacing between the letters narrowed. By the bottom third of the page, the signatures were terrifyingly accurate. I stared at the final iteration. The loop of the P contained the distinct flat edge I had developed after fracturing my wrist during a high school softball game. It was a microscopic physical quirk, a habit born of stiff tendons and physical therapy. My mother had not just copied my name. She had studied the architecture of my handwriting. She had practiced the mechanics of my identity until her muscle memory could seamlessly impersonate mine. A cold, hollow sensation settled in my chest. Suspecting that your parent intends to exploit you is a theoretical exercise. It exists in the realm of probability. Seeing the physical blueprint of that exploitation is a visceral shock. It is the moment the abstract threat becomes a tangible weapon aimed directly at your heart. For a fleeting second, the daughter in me wanted to react. I wanted to march into our house, slam the paper onto the kitchen island, and demand an explanation. I wanted to see her face falter. I wanted to scream. But screaming is a biological reflex, not a strategy. My father had taught me that reacting to a crisis with emotion is the fastest way to lose control of the outcome. In actuarial science, when you discover a critical flaw in a risk model, you do not immediately burn the data. You preserve the anomaly. You isolate it, study it, and use it to predict the system's exact point of failure. I did not crumple the paper. I did not touch the glass. I carefully smoothed my expression, even though I was alone in the room. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I opened a secure scanning application, one that utilized heavy encryption protocols. I hovered the camera lens over the glass platen. I took 3 high-resolution photographs, ensuring the lighting captured the pen pressure and the indentations on the paper. I then opened my email client and routed the images to a secure cloud server, a digital vault tied to an email address Diane did not know existed. I watched the progress bar fill, the data uploaded bouncing off servers thousands of miles away, safe from any local interference. Once the transfer was confirmed, I deleted the images from my phone's local storage. I looked down at the physical piece of paper. Diane had left it behind in a rush, likely hurrying out the door to attend her evening Rotary Club dinner. It was a sloppy, arrogant mistake. If I removed the paper, she would eventually realize her error. She would know that I knew. The element of surprise would vanish, and she would simply find a different, perhaps more destructive method to execute her fraud. I memorized the exact angle of the paper on the glass. I noted the distance from the edges of the platen. I gently closed the heavy plastic lid, leaving the forgery blueprint precisely where I had found it. I pressed the power button, plunging the machine into darkness. I walked out of the catering office, locked the deadbolt, and stepped into the freezing autumn air. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to my car. The discovery shifted the entire landscape of the conflict. I had crossed a dangerous threshold. I now possessed the exact mechanism of the crime. I knew the how. Diane intended to forge my signature on a legal instrument to bypass the trust restrictions, but actuarial models require complete variables to function. I had the how, but I was entirely blind to the what and the when. I did not know what specific document she intended to forge. Would it be a power of attorney? A direct bank transfer request? A liquidation order? I also lacked the timeline. My 21st birthday was 3 months away. The trust vested on that exact date. She could execute the forgery the day before, or she could be preparing paperwork to file the moment the funds became liquid. This created a profound, terrifying new reality. I had to live in the same house as the woman actively practicing the theft of my future. I had to share morning coffee with her. I had to sit across the dinner table and listen to her complain about florist invoices and country club politics. I had to watch her smile, watch her ask about my day, and watch her pretend to be a devoted mother, all while knowing she spent her evenings tracing the flat edge of my cursive P. The psychological toll of that deception is difficult to quantify. Every interaction became an exercise in extreme emotional discipline. When she handed me a plate of food, I had to suppress the urge to flinch. When she praised my academic focus to a visiting neighbor, I had to force a demure, grateful smile. I became an actor trapped on a stage with a director who intended to drop a sandbag on my head during the final act. I spent my nights in my bedroom running the scenarios on my calculator. I needed legal leverage. A scanned practice sheet was powerful circumstantial evidence, but a skilled defense attorney could argue it was merely a parent organizing paperwork or practicing calligraphy. It was not a completed crime. The intent to commit fraud is not the same as the execution of fraud. The mathematics of the situation dictated a chilling conclusion. A trap is only lethal if the prey steps fully inside. If I confronted her now, she could claim it was a misunderstanding. She could destroy the forged documents, change her tactics, and I would be left looking like the paranoid, unstable daughter she had convinced the town I was. I would lose the high ground. To permanently neutralize the threat, I needed a finished crime. I needed a document that carried legal weight, stamped, signed, and submitted to a fiduciary authority. I had to let her finish the forgery. I had to allow her to present the fraudulent instrument to the bank. I had to walk directly into the jaws of the trap, wait for the steel teeth to snap shut, and then dismantle the mechanism from the inside. It was a terrifying risk. If my calculations were wrong, if the bank processed the transaction too quickly, the $250,000 would vanish into the black hole of her commercial debt. I would be left with nothing but a worthless scan on a cloud server. But it was the only path that guaranteed her undeniable exposure. I set my alarm for the next morning. I laid out my clothes for my university classes. I prepared to wake up, walk downstairs, and wish my mother a good morning with a steady voice. The waiting game had begun. The variables were locked. Now it was just a matter of enduring the silence until the numbers aligned. To defeat a community narrative, you must build an unassailable fortress of empirical evidence. A local notary and a beloved business owner can sway a sheriff or a bank manager with tears and Midwestern charm. To counter that, I needed data that possessed no emotion and required no interpretation. I began treating the past 12 months of my own life as a forensic subject. In actuarial science, when we evaluate the integrity of a system, we do not rely on a single source of reporting. We triangulate. We pull distinct overlapping datasets that confirm the same reality from different angles, eliminating the possibility of a localized error. I applied this principle to my physical whereabouts. Diane was practicing my signature, which meant she intended to execute a legal document. Legal documents require dates. I needed to prove my exact location for every single day of the past year, stripping away any window of opportunity she might try to exploit. I started with my digital footprint. I logged into my cellular provider portal and requested a raw export of my encrypted location history. I did the same with my campus network access logs, generating a spreadsheet that recorded the exact minute my laptop connected to the university wireless routers in specific lecture halls. I printed my bank transaction histories, highlighting physical point-of-sale purchases that placed me in local coffee shops and grocery stores at verified times. Next, I secured my academic records. I visited the university registrar and requested official sealed copies of my transcripts. I contacted my professors to obtain proctored examination logs, printed sheets bearing their signatures that confirmed I was seated at a specific desk, taking specific tests on specific dates. Then I turned to the international data. The previous autumn, using a small educational grant my father had set aside before his death, I had traveled to the United Kingdom to attend a specialized statistics seminar at the London School of Economics. It was a trip Diane had openly resented, calling it a frivolous waste of resources that could have been better spent helping the catering business. I retrieved my passport from a fireproof lockbox under my bed. I turned to the visa pages. The entry and exit stamps from Heathrow Airport were stamped in stark black ink. They were federal, undeniable proof of my physical absence from the United States during the crucial weeks of October. I drove to a commercial office supply store 3 towns over to avoid any local gossip recognizing me. I purchased a thick, heavy-duty legal binder, a box of reinforced plastic sleeves, and a set of alphabetical divider tabs. When I returned to my apartment, I sat at my desk and assembled the trap. Tab A contained the federal passport records. Tab B held the encrypted cellular location data and network login timestamps. Tab C secured the financial receipts and official university transcripts. I cross-referenced every page, ensuring the timeline was airtight. I built a physical ledger of my existence that no amount of tears or fake smiles could dismantle. I closed the heavy cover of the binder. I reached into my bag, retrieved my father's vintage financial calculator, and placed it squarely on top of the black plastic. It sat there like a paperweight, but it functioned as a talisman. It was a physical reminder of the man who had taught me how to read the truth in the numbers guarding the evidence that would ultimately protect his legacy. While I was fortifying my defenses in the dark, my mother was busy smoothing the ground in the light. As the calendar slowly inched closer to my 21st birthday, Diane orchestrated a relentless campaign of maternal warmth. The psychological mechanics of a predator require them to pacify their target just before the strike. If the target feels threatened, they might move, disrupting the carefully calculated trajectory of the trap. Diane needed me comfortable. She needed me compliant. The shift in her behavior was jarring. During my weekend visits home, the woman who usually ignored me in favor of floral catalogs suddenly treated me like a prized guest. She began returning from her catering office with small, expensive gifts. One Friday evening, she handed me a white bakery box tied with twine containing a dozen artisanal macarons from a boutique in Milwaukee. Another afternoon, I found a soft cashmere scarf draped over the foot of my childhood bed, the price tag conspicuously left tucked inside the fold. She altered her vocabulary. The curt, demanding tones she usually reserved for me were replaced by a honeyed, melodic cadence. She started calling me sweetheart and honey. She would linger by the kitchen island, asking gentle questions about my actuarial exams, feigning interest in the statistical models I was studying. She would reach out and brush a stray strand of hair behind my ear, projecting the aura of a mother overwhelmed with affection for her youngest child. A daughter who did not know the truth might have been moved. A daughter desperate for her mother's love might have lowered her guard, interpreting the gifts and the gentle touches as a genuine reconciliation. I accepted every pastry and every piece of clothing with a blank, polite smile. I sat at the kitchen island and answered her questions about my exams in a calm, measured voice. I allowed her to brush the hair from my face without flinching. I did not feel loved. I felt audited. I recognized these gestures for exactly what they were. They were not apologies for a lifetime of neglect. They were line items in a fraud budget. When a corporation plans a hostile takeover, they allocate funds for public relations and appeasement strategies. Diane was simply managing her overhead. The cashmere scarf and the bakery boxes were operational expenses, calculated investments designed to keep the mark docile until the fraudulent paperwork could be processed. Every time she called me sweetheart, I translated it into a risk mitigation tactic. The tension in our house grew dense and heavy like the atmospheric pressure dropping before a severe Midwestern storm. We were both performing. She was playing the role of the devoted mother securing her family's future, while I played the role of the oblivious daughter trusting her caregiver. We moved through the hallways and shared meals in a state of high alert, each of us believing we held the winning hand. I spent the next 2 months living in this state of suspended animation. I retreated to my campus apartment during the week, reviewing my binder and checking the locks on my door. On the weekends, I returned to the staging ground, eating her expensive pastries and watching the clock tick down toward my birthday. I was fully armed, waiting in the dark for her to make the final fatal error. I thought I had accounted for every variable. I believed my fortress was impenetrable. But statistical models are only as reliable as the data fed into them, and human beings are inherently volatile inputs. 2 weeks before my trust was scheduled to vest, the carefully maintained silence of my apartment was shattered by a frantic, rhythmic knocking at my front door. I checked the peephole. It was not my mother. It was my sister. Kelsey stood in the hallway, gripping the strap of her designer handbag with white knuckles. Her usually flawless makeup was smeared and her posture had collapsed. The golden child, the presentation layer of our family's flawless facade, was standing on my welcome mat, unraveling at the seams. And she carried a piece of intelligence that would force me to accelerate my entire timeline. I opened the door to my campus apartment. The biting Wisconsin wind swept into the hallway, but the chill radiating from the woman standing on my welcome mat was far colder. Kelsey pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. The golden child of the Palmer family did not look golden today. She looked like a structural failure in progress. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled. The flawless blowout she usually maintained was pulled back into a severe, uneven knot. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the mascara smudged beneath her lower lashes, stripping away the presentation layer our mother had spent 2 decades curating. I closed the door and turned to face her, leaning against the cheap wood of my apartment threshold. I did not offer her a chair. I did not ask what was wrong. In my profession, when a highly volatile asset presents itself at your door, you wait for it to disclose its own liabilities. Kelsey paced the short length of my living room. Her expensive leather boots tapped a frantic rhythm against the linoleum. She wrapped her arms around her waist, holding herself together by sheer physical force. She looked at the textbooks stacked on my desk, then at the small kitchenette everywhere but at my face. Finally, she stopped pacing and looked at me. The pristine country club facade was entirely gone. In its place was a terrified 25-year-old woman realizing the bill for her childhood was due. "The business is underwater, Iris," she said. Her voice cracked, lacking the bright, careless tone she usually projected. I saw the merchant statements. Mom left her laptop open on the kitchen island. The vendors are demanding cash on delivery. The country club is threatening to cancel my venue reservation if the final deposit is not wired by next week. The whole catering company is drowning. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I had known the company was insolvent for months. Hearing my sister confirm the data did not surprise me. What surprised me was that she had finally chosen to read the numbers. Kelsey had spent her entire life outsourcing her conscience to our mother, enjoying the imported orchids and the luxury vehicles without ever questioning the source of the funds. Now the math had caught up with her. "I thought you said Mom always finds a way to pay for it," I replied, keeping my tone mild and even. Kelsey flinched as if I had struck her. She reached up and rubbed her temples, smearing the remnants of her makeup. "That is the thing, Iris. She does have a way. She has a solution to fix all of this. It is a creative solution. She told me she is restructuring the family assets to save the business and save the wedding. But she needs your help to do it." The air in my apartment grew thick. The phrase creative solution is a notorious warning flag in financial auditing. It is the language of embezzlement. Diane was not just plotting in the dark anymore. She was recruiting accomplices. She was actively bringing my sister into the conspiracy, using the impending country club wedding as the ultimate leverage to secure Kelsey's loyalty. Kelsey stepped closer to me, her hands reaching out in a pleading gesture. She needs you to be agreeable, Iris. She is preparing some paperwork. I do not know all the legal details, but it involves your trust. She just needs you to sign off on a temporary transfer. It is just a formality to secure a bridge loan. Once the summer wedding season hits, she will put the money back. I promise. I looked at my sister. The sheer gravity of her selfishness was astounding. She was standing in my apartment, fully aware that our mother was drowning in toxic commercial debt, and she was asking me to surrender my only protected asset. She was asking me to sacrifice my university tuition, my financial independence, and my father's legacy, all to ensure she could walk down a staircase draped in imported orchids. She valued a single afternoon of social validation over the entire trajectory of my future. Mom is taking a huge risk for us, Kelsey pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. She retained Brenda to process a very important document tomorrow. You know Brenda. She handles all the private estate transfers for the club members. She is taking care of the notarization quietly so the local banks do not raise any warning flags. You just need to go along with whatever Mom asks. Please, Iris. If you fight her on this, my wedding is ruined. The family is ruined. The final piece of the puzzle dropped into place with a deafening silent crash. Brenda. My mind immediately pulled up the file on Brenda Vance. She was a fixture in our community. A woman who sat on the charity boards and baked zucchini bread for the church auctions. But in her professional capacity, she was the preferred notary public for the local elite. Brenda was known for her flexibility. If a prominent businessman needed a signature verified on a Sunday evening, Brenda was there. If a country club matron forgot her identification during a property transfer, Brenda would wave it off with a friendly smile, citing their long-standing community trust. Brenda operated on the principle that the rules applied to strangers, not to the Midwestern aristocracy. Diane had not just chosen a random notary. She had selected a woman who prioritized social standing over legal rigor. Diane knew Brenda would stamp a document without asking difficult questions, especially if the request came wrapped in the guise of a sensitive family matter. My sister stood before me, weeping openly, now expecting me to absorb her panic. She expected me to comfort her, to yield to the familial pressure, and to agree to become the sacrificial lamb for the Palmer Catering empire. In her mind, preserving the illusion of our wealth was the only logical choice. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not reach out to hold her hand. I looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of an actuary observing a compromised variable. I am not a sinking fund for your lifestyle, Kelsey, I said. The words were quiet, but they struck her with physical force. She stepped back, her eyes widening in shock. She was accustomed to a world where emotional displays yielded compliance. She had never encountered a firm, unyielding boundary. You are incredibly selfish, Kelsey, whispered her tone, turning venomous as the tears gave way to desperate anger. Mom is killing herself to keep this family afloat, and you cannot even sign a piece of paper to help her. You are going to let us lose everything. I am not letting you lose anything, I replied evenly. You spent it all already. The bill is just arriving. Kelsey stared at me for a long moment, realizing that her emotional leverage was entirely useless. The tears returned, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. She turned on her heel, grabbed her designer handbag, and fled my apartment. She chose to retreat to our mother's comfortable lies rather than face the unforgiving reality of the ledger. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the silence. I walked over to my desk and placed my hand on my father's financial calculator. Kelsey's visit had been a profound tactical error on Diane's part. By sending her golden child to soften me up, Diane had inadvertently handed me the exact schematics of the trap. I now knew the timing. The paperwork was being processed tomorrow. I knew the method, a creative restructuring of the trust. And most importantly, I knew the mechanism. Brenda. My resolve crystallized into something hard and unbreakable. I understood exactly who the players were on this board. Diane was shielded by her maternal status and her immense social capital. The community would always give a grieving widow the benefit of the doubt. Attacking my mother directly would be a grueling, unpredictable war of attrition. But Brenda was different. Brenda was not protected by motherhood or grief. Brenda was a state-commissioned official. Her entire livelihood, her freedom, and her standing in the community depended on her notary license. If she certified a forged signature, she was not just making a social faux pas. She was committing a felony. Brenda was the weakest link in the chain of fraud. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain but a modest kickback from my mother. I realized that to defeat Diane, I did not need to prove my mother was a thief. I only needed to prove that Brenda was a liar. If I could mathematically corner the notary, the entire fraudulent structure would collapse under its own weight. I opened my binder, reviewed my passport stamps one last time, and prepared for the final devastating confrontation. The trap was ready, and I knew exactly how to trigger it. The eve of my 21st birthday arrived with a quiet snowfall that dusted the Wisconsin roads in a layer of pristine white. My phone chimed late in the afternoon with a text message from Diane. She asked me to meet her at the catering company's showcase kitchen at 7 o'clock for a private celebratory dinner. The showcase kitchen was a separate glass-enclosed space at the front of the warehouse. It was built exclusively for high-net-worth clients to sample tasting menus before booking their galas. It featured imported Italian marble counters, copper cookware hanging from wrought iron racks, and an atmosphere designed to project unparalleled culinary luxury. When I pushed through the glass doors, the scent of seared beef and rosemary reduction filled the air. Diane stood at the commercial range wearing a sleek black dress protected by a pristine white chef apron. This alone was a jarring anomaly. My mother rarely cooked anymore. She managed the business, directed the staff, and shook hands, but she almost never touched the pans. Tonight, she was personally searing a prime filet mignon. She turned as I entered, greeting me with a radiant, welcoming smile. She directed me to sit at the intimate tasting table set for two. The table was dressed in heavy linen adorned with a low floral centerpiece and flickering taper candles. A bottle of vintage Bordeaux, the kind she usually reserved for the country club president, breathed in a crystal decanter. The entire setup was a masterclass in psychological theater. Diane poured the dark wine into a wide glass and set it before me. She sat across the table, leaning forward on her elbows, giving me her undivided, sparkling attention. For the first 20 years of my life, getting my mother to look at me for more than 10 consecutive seconds required a crisis in the inventory ledger. Now she was looking at me as if I were the most fascinating person in Dane County. We ate the exquisite meal while the snow fell outside the warehouse windows. Diane guided the conversation with effortless grace. She reminisced about my childhood, selectively plucking out the few pleasant memories we shared and polishing them until they shone. She recalled the time I organized her spice pantry by alphabetical order when I was 8, laughing softly at my early penchant for categorization. She was weaving a narrative of maternal fondness, constructing a history of closeness that had never actually existed. In the discipline of risk analysis, when an entity offers a sudden, unprompted dividend, you immediately audit their liabilities. A spontaneous payout is almost always designed to distract investors from a failing balance sheet. I chewed my food, took small sips of the rich wine, and waited for her to present the invoice. It arrived during the dessert course. Diane pushed her plate aside and folded her manicured hands on the table. The ambient lighting caught the subtle sheen of her pearl earrings. Her voice lowered, adopting a tone of profound, respectful sincerity. "Iris." She began, looking deeply into my eyes. "You are turning 21 tomorrow. You are a brilliant, capable woman. For a long time, I let Kelsey take up all the oxygen in this family because she was loud and demanding. But I see you. I see how hard you work, and I see the incredible mind you have. You have your father's head for numbers, and that is a rare, precious gift." She paused, letting the validation hang in the air. It was a targeted surgical strike. For a daughter who had spent her entire life relegated to the shadows, serving as the invisible labor force, hearing those words should have been intoxicating. She was offering me the exact recognition I had craved as a child. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm. "The catering business is expanding," she continued, her eyes shining with manufactured excitement. "We are booking larger events, taking on more corporate clients. But I cannot manage the logistical back end alone anymore. Kelsey is wonderful with the clients, but she cannot balance a ledger to save her life. I need a real partner. I need you." She squeezed my hand gently. "I want to offer you a 20% ownership stake in Palmer Catering. We will rebrand the back-end operations. You can run the entire financial division. Palmer and daughter. We can finally be a real team, Iris. Just you and me building an empire together." The breath stilled in my lungs. The offer hung in the quiet space between us, gleaming with the promise of equality, respect, and maternal love. It was the ultimate emotional bribe. She was wrapping the validation I had starved for around a toxic, collapsing financial structure. She was inviting me onto a sinking ship and calling it a luxury cruise. Diane smiled a soft, encouraging expression, and then seamlessly deployed the trap. "To set up the partnership structure and clear out the old corporate filings, we are going to do a little internal reorganization tomorrow," she said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "We have a brief meeting scheduled with your father's trust executor in the morning. There is just a bit of paperwork to sign to restructure our assets and merge the accounts. It will take 10 minutes, and then the business is officially 20% yours." The phrase dropped into the room. Just a bit of paperwork. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. The mathematics of the moment were staggering. Diane was not just asking me to surrender $250,000. She was pricing her affection. She had calculated the exact cost of her love, and the invoice was my entire future. She believed that I was so desperate for her approval, so thirsty for a fraction of the warmth she lavished on my sister, that I would blindly sign away my father's legacy just to be called her partner. It was a stunning, heartbreaking moment of clarity. The lingering, childish hope that my mother might eventually love me for who I was evaporated, replaced by a cold, sterile truth. She did not love me. She loved the utility I could provide. When I was a teenager, my utility was free labor in the walk-in freezer. Today, my utility was a liquid asset she needed to steal. A lesser person would have shattered. A typical daughter might have thrown the crystal wine glass against the brick wall, screaming at the betrayal. She might have overturned the table, demanding to know how a mother could look her child in the eye and lie so flawlessly. But screaming is a negotiation tactic. It implies that you want the other party to change their behavior. I did not want Diane to change her behavior. I wanted her to walk into the bank tomorrow morning believing she had won. I engaged my actuarial training, locking my emotions behind a heavy steel vault. I kept my breathing steady. I did not pull my hand away from hers. I allowed the silence to stretch for a brief, natural moment, letting her believe I was overwhelmed by the generosity of her offer. I looked at her, matching her warm gaze with a perfectly flat, polite smile. "I look forward to seeing the paperwork, Mom," I said. Diane exhaled a quiet, almost imperceptible release of tension. Her smile widened, reaching her eyes with genuine relief. She patted my hand, picked up her wine glass, and proposed a toast to our new partnership. We clinked our glasses together. The crystal rang with a clear, sharp chime that echoed through the empty warehouse. She spent the rest of the evening discussing floral arrangements and profit margins, entirely convinced that her psychological warfare had succeeded. She thought she had purchased my compliance with a few hollow compliments and a fake equity stake in a bankrupt company. She had no idea that while she was celebrating her victory, I was finalizing the audit of her ruin. I drove back to my campus apartment that night, the snow crunching beneath my tires. I packed my father's financial calculator, the thick legal binder containing my passport stamps and university logs, and a single black pen. The emotional battlefield was closed. I had rejected the bribe, silently locking my heart away for good. The next time I saw my mother, we would not be sitting at a tasting table. We would be sitting in a bank, and the currency we would be dealing in was felony fraud. The morning of my 21st birthday was bright and unseasonably cold. The sunlight reflected off the freezing surface of Lake Monona, casting sharp, pale angles of light through the tall windows of Madison First National Bank. I walked through the heavy revolving doors at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying my canvas messenger bag. The ambient noise of the lobby, the clicking of polished shoes on marble, and the low hum of banking transactions faded as I took the elevator up to the executive trust department. This was the environment Diane had chosen for her final maneuver. It was an arena designed to intimidate, built on the architecture of institutional authority. Mr. Caldwell, the fiduciary executor assigned to my father's estate, waited in a corner office that smelled of lemon polish and aged leather. He was a meticulous man in his late 50s, wearing a gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses that rested near the tip of his nose. His desk was a massive slab of polished mahogany, clear of any clutter except for a single thick manila file bearing my family name. When I stepped into the room, the trap was already fully assembled. My mother sat in one of the high-backed guest chairs. She wore a charcoal wool blazer, and her signature pearl earrings projecting the serene, capable aura of a grieving widow who had successfully managed her family through a decade of hardship. She turned and offered me a brilliant, encouraging smile. It was the exact same smile she had worn the night before in the showcase kitchen, the one she used to sell the illusion of partnership and maternal devotion. Seated to her right was Brenda. The notary public looked drastically out of place in the sterile, high-stakes environment of a corporate trust office. Brenda gripped her leather-bound logbook with tense fingers, her shoulders rigid beneath her modest cardigan. She offered a quick, nervous nod as I took the empty chair beside my mother, but her eyes darted immediately back to the brass lamp on the executor's desk. Mr. Caldwell opened the manila folder. The thick parchment pages rustled in the quiet room. He cleared his throat, a dry professional sound, and folded his hands over the open file. "Happy birthday, Iris," he began, his tone carrying the formal weight of his office. "Today marks the maturity of the educational trust established by your late father. As the designated executor, it is my fiduciary duty to ensure these funds are transferred into your direct control, unencumbered, as stipulated by the founding documents. The current liquid value of the account is $250,000. He reached for a stack of transfer authorization forms, placing a silver pen beside them. Before I could reach for the pen, Diane intervened. Her timing was flawless, executed with the smooth, unhurried grace of a seasoned performer. Before we finalized the disbursement, Mr. Caldwell, Diane said, her voice warm and collaborative. "We have a minor administrative update to process. Iris and I discussed this over a wonderful dinner last night. We are officially restructuring our assets to bring her on as a partner in Palmer Catering." Mr. Caldwell paused, his hand hovering over the paperwork. "A restructuring." "Yes," Diane continued, reaching into her designer tote bag. She withdrew a crisp 3-page document printed on heavy bond paper and slid it across the mahogany desk. Iris took out a commercial loan from the family business last year to cover her university housing and various living expenses, while she focused on her studies. "We are simply executing a debt acknowledgement today to clear the internal ledger before the new partnership takes effect." She turned to look at me, her expression radiating deep maternal pride. She was playing the role of the generous benefactor, the mother who had floated her daughter a massive loan and was now tidying up the paperwork like a responsible business owner. It was a masterful deployment of environmental suppression. She knew that in a formal banking setting surrounded by legal professionals and hushed voices, the social pressure to conform was immense. A good Midwestern daughter does not throw a tantrum in a trust office. She nods signs where she is told and protects the family dignity. Mr. Caldwell picked up the document. The room grew still as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and read the text. The air filtration system hummed a low, steady drone in the background. "I see," Mr. Caldwell murmured, tracing a finger down the first page. "This is an unsecured promissory note. It states that Iris borrowed $250,000 from Palmer Catering on October 14th of last year." He flipped to the second page, his brow furrowing slightly in concentration. "The terms stipulated here direct my office to satisfy this debt immediately upon the vesting of the trust. This instrument legally redirects the entirety of the principal, the full $250,000, directly into the corporate accounts of Palmer Catering. It leaves the trust balance at zero. He looked over the rim of his glasses, first at Diane, then at me. It was a staggering financial maneuver. He was an institutional man bound by strict protocols, and while the document was highly unusual for an educational trust, it was formatted correctly. The legalese was dense and binding. He turned to the final page. "And this has already been executed," he noted, his eyes scanning the bottom of the sheet. Diane offered a soft, dismissive wave of her hand. "We wanted to save you the administrative hassle this morning. Brenda was kind enough to join us to verify the documentation. We handled the notarization when the loan was originally drafted last fall. We just needed to present the original instrument to you today for processing." Mr. Caldwell looked at Brenda. The notary forced a tight, close-lipped smile and offered a jerky nod of confirmation, tapping her hand against her logbook. Diane shifted in her chair, turning her full attention to me. The triumphant warmth in her gaze was terrifying. It was the look of a predator watching the final latch on the cage click shut. She had orchestrated the entire scenario to leave me with no escape route. The document was in the hands of the authority. The notary was present to validate it. The narrative of my reckless spending and her generous bailout had been planted in the community for months. She expected me to fold. She expected the sheer weight of the room and the magnitude of the lie to crush any resistance I might offer. She expected the unmeasured variable to remain silent. I did not fold. I reached into my canvas bag and retrieved my father's vintage financial calculator. I placed it on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The matte black plastic and faded gold keys stood in stark contrast to the pristine legal documents. The physical presence of the device grounded me, a tactile reminder of the logic and precision my father had taught me. Mr. Caldwell slid the promissory note toward my side of the desk so I could review it. I looked down at the forgery. It was a breathtaking piece of theft. The cursive signature at the bottom of the page was an exact replica of my own, right down to the flat edge on the loop of the P. Next to it, the crisp purple ink of Brenda's official state seal glared against the white paper. The text beneath the seal swore under penalty of perjury that I had physically stood before Brenda in Dane County on October 14th and signed away my future. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rhythmic metallic ticking of the large wall clock behind the executor's desk. Every second that passed heightened the tension. Diane's smile remained fixed, but a microscopic tremor of impatience began to show in the rigid set of her jaw. She was waiting for the surrender. I did not give her a surrender. I engaged the trap. I kept my hands resting lightly on either side of the forged contract. My face remained an unreadable flat mask. I did not raise my voice, nor did I inject any of the hysterical pitch my mother had spent months trying to manufacture in me. When I spoke, my tone was purely clinical, the voice of an auditor identifying a fatal flaw in a corporate ledger. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with the executor, "I appreciate you reviewing this instrument. However, before you process any transfer, I need to point out a severe mathematical impossibility in the document's execution." Mr. Caldwell blinked, surprised by the detached analytical nature of my response. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "A mathematical impossibility," he repeated. Diane's flawless posture slipped by a fraction of an inch. Her eyes darted toward me, a flash of genuine uncertainty breaking through the maternal facade. "Yes," I replied smoothly. I placed my index finger on the bottom of the page, right next to the purple notary stamp. I slowly pushed the document back to the center of the mahogany table, sliding it away from me and stopping it exactly equidistant between the three of us. Then I turned my head away from the executor. I ignored my mother entirely. I locked my eyes directly onto Brenda the notary. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda. She was a woman who had built her entire life on the soft favors and unspoken compromises of a small town. She had inherited a modest tax preparation business from her father, a man who had taught her that keeping the local aristocracy happy was the key to steady work. Brenda processed property deeds and estate transfers for the country club members, often waiving the strict identification rules as a gesture of Midwestern hospitality. She operated under the fatal assumption that the law was a flexible suggestion for people who attended the right church and sponsored the right charity dinners. I did not look at my mother. I looked at the woman who had sold my future for a fraction of her own convenience. Brenda shifted under my gaze. She reached up and touched the collar of her cardigan, her fingers trembling against the cheap wool. I turned my attention back to my canvas bag resting on the carpet. I reached inside and withdrew the thick black legal binder. I placed it on the mahogany desk right next to my father's financial calculator. The heavy thud of the binder echoed in the quiet office. Mr. Caldwell watched me, his hands still resting on the open manila folder. Diane opened her mouth to speak, attempting to reclaim the narrative with another burst of maternal charm, but I raised a single index finger. It was a universal gesture requesting silence. She froze, stunned by the sheer audacity of the interruption. I flipped open the binder. The plastic sleeves crackled in the sterile air of the trust department. I bypassed the encrypted cellular data and the financial receipts. I went straight to the federal documentation. I extracted a high-resolution color-certified copy of my United States passport and slid it across the table toward the executor. I pointed to a specific page on the copy. "This is my entry visa stamp from Heathrow Airport," I stated, keeping my voice even and instructional. "You will see that I entered the United Kingdom on October 12th of last year. I did not return to the United States until November 3rd. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the federal stamp. The silence in the room shifted from expectant to electric. Diane's perfect posture finally cracked. She leaned toward the table, her eyes darting between the passport copy and my face, trying to calculate the trajectory of the threat. I did not give her time to process the damage. I turned back to my binder and pulled out the next plastic sleeve. I withdrew the university transcript and the proctored examination log, both bearing the official seal of the London School of Economics and the signature of the attending professor. I placed these documents directly on top of the promissory note covering the forged signature. "These are my academic records for the autumn term." I continued, my tone devoid of any emotional inflection. "They include a time-stamped faculty-verified examination ledger." I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes onto the notary public. Brenda was shrinking into her chair. The ruddy, healthy flush of a woman who spent her weekends gardening vanished, leaving behind a pale, terrified mask. On October 14th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Central Standard Time, I said, pronouncing each word with chilling clarity, the exact time this document was supposedly notarized in this county. I was sitting in a lecture hall in London, England, taking an actuarial statistics midterm. The air in the executive office grew heavy and suffocating. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a metronome counting down to a detonation. Mr. Caldwell sat back in his large leather chair, the full weight of the situation settling upon his shoulders. He was an institutional fiduciary. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He was looking at a severe, undeniable financial crime. I did not accuse Diane of forgery. Accusing a mother of stealing from her child invites emotional debate. It invites tears, excuses, and pleas for family unity. I bypassed the mother-daughter dynamic entirely. I attacked the weakest structural point of the fraud. I focused the entire pressure of the room onto the state-commissioned official who had facilitated the theft. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the mahogany desk, and delivered the fatal blow. "Brenda," I said softly, asking the most devastating question of the morning. "How exactly did you verify my physical identification and witness my live signature in Wisconsin while I was 4,000 miles away?" Brenda stopped breathing. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She looked at the passport copy, then at the examination log, and finally at the purple ink of her own official seal on the fraudulent promissory note. The mathematical impossibility of her certification was staring her in the face. She could not claim it was a simple administrative error. You cannot mistakenly verify the physical presence of a person who is sitting on another continent. The legal jeopardy transferred in the blink of an eye. 5 minutes ago, the threat was aimed directly at my inheritance. Now, the threat was aimed squarely at Brenda's freedom. The penalty for notary fraud, specifically in the commission of a 6-figure financial theft, is not a fine. It is the revocation of the state commission, the destruction of a professional livelihood, and a very real probability of state incarceration. Brenda realized this with sudden, crushing clarity. The friendly, flexible favor she had done for a prominent local business owner had just transformed into a felony trap. Diane sensed the collapse of her accomplice. She attempted a frantic rescue maneuver. "Mr. Caldwell." Diane interrupted, her voice tight and slightly shrill, losing the warm resonance she had cultivated for decades. "There must be a misunderstanding with the dates. Iris is terribly disorganized with her paperwork. We can clear this up outside the office. Just return the document to me, and we will sort out the administrative error at home." She reached across the desk, her manicured fingers extending toward the forged promissory note. Mr. Caldwell reacted with the swift, unforgiving reflex of a man whose institution was being used to facilitate a crime. He placed his large hand firmly over the documents, pulling them out of Diane's reach. He did not speak, but the gesture was a physical barricade. Diane's hand hovered in the empty air. The flawless, unyielding posture of the county fair queen snapped. Her shoulders slumped and her jaw tightened into a rigid line of panic. She looked at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in her eyes. She had spent her entire adulthood controlling the narrative. She had manipulated the neighbors, leveraged the catering business, and treated my future as her own personal checking account. She believed that her status as my mother granted her immunity from consequence. She thought she could rewrite reality through sheer force of will. But she could not rewrite a federal customs stamp. She could not charm a time-stamped examination log. The raw, unfiltered data was sitting on the table, and it cared nothing for her social standing. Brenda let out a low, whimpering sound, a noise belonging to a trapped animal. Her hands shook so badly, she dropped her leather-bound logbook onto the carpet. The heavy thud broke the silence, but Brenda made no effort to retrieve it. She shrank away from Diane, pressing herself against the armrest of her chair, desperate to create physical distance between herself and the architect of her ruin. The Midwestern loyalty Diane had relied upon was evaporating in the cold light of federal evidence. When faced with the prospect of prison community trust, dissolves very quickly. I sat perfectly still, observing the wreckage. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I maintained the detached, analytical posture of my profession. I had calculated the odds, identified the vulnerability, and triggered the mechanism. The trap had closed exactly as the risk model predicted. The threat was no longer mine to manage. It belonged to the bank, the executor, and the terrified notary public who was currently realizing she had traded her entire life for a modest cash bribe. Brenda Vance had spent 40 years verifying property lines for local dairy farmers and stamping car titles for high school graduates. Her entire identity was wrapped in the quiet, respectable authority of her state commission. She was a woman who baked zucchini bread for church auctions and believed that keeping the local elite happy was simply the cost of doing business in a small town. She navigated life by keeping things pleasant. She stamped real estate transfers for the Rotary Club members without asking for identification, because asking would be considered rude in our culture. She traded in the currency of soft favors. Now, the bill for a lifetime of minor ethical compromises had arrived all at once, carrying a felony charge. Watching a federal passport stamp invalidate her official seal was the equivalent of watching her own obituary being drafted in real time. The air left her lungs in a ragged, audible gasp. She looked at Diane. The unspoken pact of our tight-knit Wisconsin community was that the wealthy protected the loyal. But sitting in that sterile trust office, Brenda realized Diane possessed no power to shield her from a federal banking investigation. The Midwestern loyalty evaporated instantly. Pure survival instinct took over. Brenda began to shake. She vibrated with a terror so profound it seemed to pull the pigment from her skin. "Mr. Caldwell," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy, devoid of its usual neighborly warmth. "I did not know. Diane brought the paperwork to my house on a Sunday evening. She told me Iris was overwhelmed with university exams and could not make the trip down from campus. She said it was just a standard family loan update." The signature was already on the line when she handed the paper to me. Diane turned her head sharply. She fixed Brenda with a glacial glare designed to silence insubordinate catering staff and hesitant floral vendors. Brenda did not stop talking. The dam had broken, and the truth poured out in a desperate flood. Diane told me the bank required the stamp by Monday morning to secure the catering business payroll. Brenda continued the words, tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. She handed me an envelope. There was a cash bonus inside for the weekend inconvenience. $500. She said it was a thank you gift for being such a good friend to the family all these years. I never meant to break the law. I just thought I was helping a widow keep her business running. The executor did not offer Brenda comfort. Mr. Caldwell was a man who measured morality in decimal points and statutory compliance. He was a fiduciary bound by strict regulations that governed the transfer of generational wealth. He was not a judge, but in this room his authority was absolute. His institution was subject to regular federal audits. A forged promissory note executing a six-figure trust transfer was the exact kind of event that triggered federal investigations and ruined institutional reputations. He was acting to protect his bank from my mother's financial contagion. He reached across his desk and pulled the forged promissory note into the center of his leather blotter, aligning the edges perfectly. He then placed my passport copy and the university examination log directly beside it. He opened a deep drawer and withdrew a heavy manila evidence envelope, the kind used by corporate compliance officers to quarantine compromised assets. He slid the forged document inside, sealed the flap, and placed his hands flat on top of the package. "The disbursement of this trust is halted effective immediately," Mr. Caldwell announced. His voice was no longer the polite, accommodating tone of a financial advisor. It was the sterile, unyielding declaration of a legal authority. "I am impounding this instrument. Under state and federal fiduciary regulations, presenting a falsified document to redirect a protected trust is not an administrative oversight. It is attempted grand theft and fraud. My office is legally obligated to report this transaction to the Banking Commission and the local authorities." The meticulous narrative Diane had spent 2 decades constructing disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The town's most respected businesswoman, the martyr who had bravely carried her family through grief, was reduced to a common thief caught in a clumsy scheme. The troubled, irresponsible daughter she had warned the community about had just dismantled her entire empire using nothing but a calendar and a college transcript. A cornered predator will often attempt to camouflage itself when the primary attack fails. Diane tried to camouflage her felony in the guise of Midwestern hospitality. She let out a high, artificial laugh. The sound bounced off the heavy wainscoting, brittle and hollow, lacking any genuine amusement. The pearl earrings she wore seemed suddenly too large, appearing like costume jewelry on a woman playing a theatrical part that had just been canceled. Her hands, usually so expressive and commanding, fluttered nervously over her wool blazer, seeking an anchor that no longer existed. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, please," Diane said, waving her hand as if swatting away a pesky summer insect. "Let us not overreact and use words like fraud. This is just a simple paperwork error between family. Iris and I have been discussing this restructuring for weeks. I merely tried to expedite the process to save us all a little time." The signature was just a placeholder until she could come down here and sign the final draft in person. Brenda simply got confused about the procedure. Diane smiled her most radiant, charming smile. She directed it at the executor, banking on her immense social capital to smooth over the federal violation. It was the same smile she used to convince the country club board to double their catering budget. It was the smile that had secured her merchant cash advances and funded Kelsey's luxury vehicle leases. But Mr. Caldwell did not belong to the country club. He belonged to the ledger. He stared back at her with a face carved from granite. The silence in the room stretched thick and unforgiving. No one returned her smile. No one offered her a lifeline. The room remained cold and silent. I sat perfectly still in my chair. My hands remained folded over my father's brass calculator. I did not feel the urge to interject or defend myself. The data was speaking on my behalf. In actuarial science, there is a concept known as a structural failure cascade. It occurs when the primary load-bearing element of a system snaps, causing every subsequent support to collapse in rapid succession. I was watching the structural failure cascade of my mother's entire life. For years, I had analyzed the toxic leverage she used to fund Kelsey's lifestyle. I had tallied the cost of the imported orchids and the designer wardrobes. I had endured the whispered gossip of the pastor's wife and the pitying looks from the pharmacist. I had accepted the social exile to ensure this precise moment would arrive. Looking at her now, desperately trying to laugh off a prison sentence, I felt no anger. I felt the detached observation of a professional auditing a ruined ledger. The math had finally balanced. Diane looked at me. Her artificial laugh faded, replaced by a stark, horrifying realization. She saw the vintage financial calculator resting under my hands. She saw the thick black binder containing the undeniable proof of my existence. For the first time, she understood that I had not stumbled into this victory by accident. She realized I had known about the forgery blueprint left on the copy machine. She realized I had sat across from her at the showcase kitchen the night before eating her seared steak and listening to her fake equity offer while holding the federal evidence that would destroy her. The compliant invisible daughter had engineered an airtight trap, and she had walked into it with a smile on her face. When the architecture of a lie collapses, the architect rarely accepts the ruin with grace. Diane stared at the vintage financial calculator resting under my hands, and her mind cycled rapidly through the few remaining survival tactics available to a cornered predator. The charming Midwestern businesswoman had failed. The indignant, misunderstood mother had failed. The federal evidence sitting in the manila evidence envelope on the executor's desk had stripped away every layer of her pristine camouflage. She was left with only one tool in her arsenal, the most desperate and primitive weapon of all. She resorted to hysterical guilt. The physical transformation was jarring to witness. The woman who had spent 52 years curating an image of unyielding elegance seemed to physically deflate. Her shoulders hunched forward, ruining the tailored lines of her charcoal wool blazer. The rigid, perfect posture of the county fair queen snapped, replaced by the trembling, erratic movements of a defaulting debtor, realizing the bank is foreclosing on her life. She slipped from the edge of the high-backed guest chair, her knees hitting the executive carpet with a dull, heavy thud. Mr. Caldwell recoiled, pressing his back against his leather chair. He was a fiduciary, a man accustomed to discussing mutual funds, mortality tables, and generational wealth transfers. The sight of a prominent local business owner dropping to her knees in his sterile office offended his deep institutional sensibilities. Brenda remained frozen in her seat, her eyes wide, watching the woman she had feared and respected degrade herself on the floor. Diane reached across the short distance between us and grabbed the fabric of my coat. Her manicured fingernails dug into the heavy wool. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, carving dark tracks of mascara down her cheeks. These were genuine tears, but they were not born of remorse. They were born of pure distilled terror. She was mourning the loss of her own freedom, mourning the death of her social empire, and she was terrified of the prison sentence looming on the horizon. "Iris, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a raw, jagged pitch. "Please do not let him call the authorities. You have to stop him. We can fix this. I will put the money back. I will sell the catering equipment. I will sell the house. Just tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him we had a verbal agreement." I looked down at the woman on the floor. She was asking me to commit perjury, to implicate myself in her financial crime, to save her from the consequences of her own theft. When I remained silent, she escalated the manipulation, deploying the toxic slogan she had used to justify her exploitation for years. Family protects family. Iris, she screamed, her voice echoing off the heavy wainscoting. I did it for us. I did it to save the business. Your father built that trust to take care of you, and I was trying to take care of all of us. Kelsey's wedding, the vendors, the payroll, I was drowning. I had no other choice. We are a family. You cannot send your own mother to jail. The sheer audacity of her defense was staggering. She was attempting to rebrand grand theft as an act of maternal sacrifice. She wanted me to believe that forging my signature, intercepting my mail, and slandering my name to the pastor's wife were all noble acts committed in the name of household survival. She was trying to convince me that the imported orchids and the luxury vehicle leases were essential utilities, and that I was the villain for refusing to underwrite them. When the guilt failed to elicit a reaction, Diane pivoted to the final, most insidious tactic. She offered me the emotional validation I had starved for throughout my entire childhood. I am so sorry, she wept, her grip tightening on my coat. I know I was hard on you. I know I focused too much on Kelsey, but I see you now, Iris. I see how brilliant and strong you are. You are the only one I can truly rely on. I love you. I love you so much. We can be a real team now, just you and me. I promise I will change. I promise I will be the mother you always deserved. Please, my sweet girl, please do not do this to me. I sat in the chair listening to the words I had spent 2 decades waiting to hear. When I was 10 years old, sorting linen napkins in the back of the catering warehouse, I would have given anything for my mother to look at me and say she loved me. When I was 15, watching her buy designer dresses for my sister while I wore clearance rack sweaters, I would have traded my own heartbeat to hear her say I was brilliant and strong. But timing and actuarial science is everything. An asset delivered 20 years past its maturity date is worthless. The love she was offering now was counterfeit currency. She was printing it in the basement of her own desperation, hoping I was naive enough to accept it as legal tender. If a bank accepts fake bills, the institution goes under. If a daughter accepts counterfeit love, she loses her life. I recognized the exact price tag attached to her tears. The cost of her affection was my complicity in her felony. I reached down and gently but firmly detached her fingers from my coat. I did not shove her away. I did not yell. I treated her hands the way an auditor treats a corrupted file, isolating the threat and removing it from the system. I stood up. The room was suffocatingly tense, filled only with the sound of Diane's ragged breathing and the ticking of the wall clock. I reached across the mahogany desk and picked up my father's vintage financial calculator. I placed it carefully into my canvas messenger bag. I reached for the heavy black binder, the forensic ledger of my existence, and slid it in right beside the calculator. I zipped the bag closed, a sharp, definitive sound that signaled the end of the audit. I looked down at the woman weeping on the executive carpet. I felt no triumph. I felt no vindication. I felt the profound, sterile relief of a mathematician who has finally solved a complex, exhausting equation. The variables were locked. The outcome was settled. There was nothing left to debate. You did not do it for us, Mom, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotional turbulence. You did it for an audience. She stared up at me, her mouth open, the tears freezing on her face. The realization that her ultimate emotional bribe had failed struck her with physical force. She had played her final card, and the table remained empty. And love. I continued adjusting the strap of my messenger bag over my shoulder. Is not a liability I am willing to underwrite anymore. I turned my back on her. I did not wait for a response. I did not look at Brenda, who was still paralyzed in her chair, or at Mr. Caldwell, who was already reaching for the heavy black telephone receiver on his desk. The dialing sequence began before I even reached the door. I walked out of the executive office, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The thick wood severed the sound of my mother's sobbing, cutting it off with a solid, satisfying click. I stepped into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the trust department. The air out here was cool and clean, free of the suffocating scent of desperation and designer perfume. I walked toward the elevators, my boots moving in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The narrative revenge stories sell us is that victory requires a shouting match, a dramatic confrontation where the villain confesses their sins and the hero stands tall over their ruined enemy. But true victory against a toxic system is much quieter. It is not about destroying the people who exploited you. The authorities and their own terrible choices were about to do that for me. Winning is simply about stepping off their balance sheet entirely. It is about removing yourself from the equation so their inevitable collapse no longer pulls you down into the rubble. I pressed the silver button for the lobby. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, welcoming me into the empty cab. I rode down to the ground floor, leaving the wreckage of Palmer Catering 3 stories above me. The legal gears were now grinding into motion, and the federal consequences were out of my hands. But the social consequences were just beginning. The small, tight-knit Wisconsin town that Diane had weaponized against me was about to receive the raw data, and the impending community reckoning would be far more unforgiving than any judge. In financial markets, a toxic asset rarely remains hidden once a regulatory body begins its audit. The same principle governs small-town secrets once a federal banking violation is triggered. I walked out of that bank and drove back to my campus apartment, leaving the explosion contained within the mahogany walls of the trust department. Shockwaves do not respect property lines. The news did not leak through a dramatic courtroom trial or a police press release. It leaked through the precise mechanism I knew would break first. Brenda Vance faced the immediate revocation of her state notary commission and the terrifying prospect of a grand theft indictment. To save herself from the maximum penalty, she immediately turned state evidence. Brenda was a creature of our local social ecosystem, and she understood that legal survival was only half the battle. She needed social survival. She began making frantic, tearful phone calls to the women in her church circle, attempting to cast herself as the naive, trusting victim of Diane Palmer and her predatory manipulation. Brenda told the pastor's wife everything. She detailed the cash bribe, the forged signature, and the breathtaking cruelty of a mother attempting to steal her own daughter's inheritance to pay for a country club wedding. Our Wisconsin community operated on a very specific moral axis. People here could forgive a failed business. They could forgive a bad harvest or a clumsy financial mistake. But they considered honest labor and family integrity to be sacred bonds. Diane had violated both of those foundational principles. She had not just stolen money. She had weaponized the empathy of the town, harvesting their casseroles and their pity under false pretenses. When the neighbors realized that the grieving widow narrative was a calculated smokescreen for felony fraud against a young student, the social correction was swift and total. The whisper campaign Diane had carefully orchestrated to paint me as a troubled youth categorically backfired. The town felt foolish for believing her, and a Midwestern town does not easily forgive the person who made them look like fools. The pity the community once directed at my mother turned into unyielding disgust. People crossed the street to avoid walking past her. The pharmacist who had once given me condescending advice about honoring my mother now refused to make eye contact with Diane when she picked up her prescriptions. The social exile Diane had designed for me immediately inverted itself onto her. The local country club, an institution deeply sensitive to public scandal, held an emergency board meeting. The prominent families who sat on the committee did not want their daughters' weddings catered by a woman currently under active investigation for stealing $250,000. They canceled the Palmer Catering contracts effective immediately, demanding their deposits back. This sudden cancellation triggered a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The predatory merchant cash advance lenders, sensing the vulnerability in the market, called in their debts. Within 3 weeks of my 21st birthday, the commercial kitchen equipment was repossessed. The pristine imported sport utility vehicles were towed away from our driveway in broad daylight, while the neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains. Diane was forced to file for total corporate bankruptcy before the month ended. Foreclosure signs sprouted on the meticulously manicured lawn of my childhood home, marking the death of the empire she had built on a foundation of lies. The structural collapse of the catering business inevitably crushed the presentation layer. Kelsey had spent her entire adult life insulated by our mother's toxic credit. She suddenly found herself standing in the wreckage without a single marketable skill. The prominent orthodontist family, the parents of her wealthy fiancé, were horrified by the public scandal unfolding in the local newspapers. They quietly pressured their son to sever ties, unwilling to merge their respectable lineage with a disgraced bankrupt caterer. The lavish summer wedding the event Diane had sacrificed my father's legacy to fund was abruptly canceled. Stripped of her golden child status, her luxury car, and her country club future, Kelsey faced the unforgiving reality of the American labor market. She possessed no university degree, and a resume consisting solely of vague administrative titles provided by a now-defunct company. The irony of the universe is rarely subtle. To survive, Kelsey was forced to accept an entry-level clerical position at a local insurance branch. She spent her days answering phones and filing the very actuarial risk assessment reports she had once mocked me for studying, sitting in a beige cubicle far removed from the imported orchids she once demanded. 2 months after the bank incident, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed my sister's name. I let it ring twice before sliding my finger across the screen to accept the connection. Iris. Kelsey wept, her voice lacking any of its former bright arrogance. It was the ragged, exhausted sound of a woman who had just worked a 10-hour shift, processing mundane insurance claims. They took the house. Mom is facing a plea deal to avoid jail time, and they seized the property to satisfy the commercial creditors. We have to move into a tiny rental apartment out by the highway. I cannot even afford the security deposit. She paused, taking a shaky breath, preparing to launch the request I knew was coming. You have your trust money now. You have everything Dad left. Please, Iris. You are the only one who has any liquid cash. Just loan me enough to get us into the apartment. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the spring wind ripple through the tall trees. I did not feel the urge to gloat. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive pleasure hearing the former golden child beg for the resources she had previously demanded I surrender. I simply felt the quiet equilibrium of a balanced ledger. I looked at the numbers in my mind. Providing cash to an insolvent entity with a history of resource mismanagement is the definition of a bad investment. Kelsey, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and devoid of malice. I will not give you a cash loan. The money Dad left is secured, and I am not opening that account to subsidize the fallout of Diane's fraud. Kelsey let out a sharp, breathless sob. How can you be so cold? She demanded, her tone shifting from pleading to bitter resentment. She is still our mother. We are still your family. A family is a mutual support structure, I replied smoothly. What you and Diane built was a parasitic ecosystem. I am offering you advice right now, Kelsey. You need to separate your finances from hers immediately. Do not co-sign that rental lease. Do not put your name on her utility bills. If you tie your newly earned income to her remaining debt, she will drag you down with her. You have a job now. Protect your own baseline. That is the only contribution I will make to your situation. I ended the call before she could formulate another emotional argument. I placed the phone face down on the small table next to my chair. I did not log onto social media to broadcast my victory. I did not draft a triumphant public statement exposing their ruin to the remaining community members who might still harbor doubts. That behavior belongs to people who are still desperate for an audience. I did not need an audience. The enablers were suffering the natural, unshielded consequences of their own financial incompetence. The State Banking Commission, the federal authorities, and the strict moral standards of our Midwestern town were delivering the justice with undeniable efficiency. I remained entirely above the fray, untethered from the wreckage, leaving the architects of the fraud to suffocate under the weight of the collapsed ceiling they had built with their own hands. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing the final phase of my father's plan was securely in my grasp, ready to be deployed into a future devoid of uncalculated risk. The formal clearing of a contested estate takes time, but time is simply another variable you can calculate. 60 days after I walked out of that mahogany office, Mr. Caldwell summoned me back to Madison First National Bank. The air in the trust department smelled identical, carrying the same dry note of radiator steam and lemon polish, but the environment had fundamentally shifted. There was no audience this time. Diane was not sitting in the high-backed guest chair. Brenda was not trembling by the desk. I sat alone across from the executor. He slid a thick stack of legitimate transfer authorizations toward me. He handed me his own silver pen. I read every line of the authentic paperwork, verifying the routing numbers and the disbursement schedules. I signed my name at the bottom of the final page, letting the loop of the P carry its natural flat edge. Mr. Caldwell countersigned, stamped the file with an official seal, and offered a firm handshake. The process was sterile, efficient, and entirely devoid of the theatrical manipulation my mother had tried to manufacture. 24 hours later, I sat at my laptop and refreshed my banking portal. The screen loaded, replacing my usual meager checking balance with a six-figure sum. $250,000. It was the exact amount my father had painstakingly accumulated over a lifetime of assessing risk and guarding against disaster. There were no flashing lights on the screen. No brass bands played in my living room to celebrate the victory. It was just a row of digital digits glowing against a white background representing the physical manifestation of my safety. I initiated a series of secure transfers that very afternoon. I routed the exact sum required to fully fund the remainder of my actuarial science degree directly to the university bursar. I took the remaining capital and divided it into a diversified low-yield investment portfolio. I selected municipal bonds and conservative index funds. I did not chase high returns or flashy startup investments. I chose stability. I built a financial fortress designed to withstand market corrections and economic downturns. I constructed the exact opposite of the toxic, highly leveraged house of cards my mother had built. Every dollar I allocated was a brick in a wall separating my future from her history of ruin. With my tuition secured and my assets shielded, I packed my belongings into cardboard boxes and left the area entirely. I did not want to remain in a county where the geography held memories of forged signatures and weaponized gossip. I drove 3 hours north, settling in a small, quiet city near the edge of the state forest. I signed a lease on a second-floor apartment with large, east-facing windows. The space was modest, but it was pristine. It featured hardwood floors, white walls, and a layout that allowed the morning sunlight to flood the living room. I unpacked my boxes slowly, taking the time to organize my new environment. I set up a sturdy wooden desk directly beneath the largest window. I placed my textbooks on the corner, aligning their spines. Then I reached into my canvas messenger bag and retrieved the vintage financial calculator. I set it squarely in the center of the desk. The faded gold lettering caught the sunlight. It was a simple, unassuming object, but it served as a monument. It was a daily reminder of the quiet, brilliant man who had taught me the mathematics of survival. He had known that a storm was coming, and he had handed me the exact tools I needed to build a shelter. People often assume that escaping a toxic family dynamic culminates in a state of euphoric joy. The movies teach us to expect a grand emotional catharsis, where the survivor dances in the rain and immediately embraces a vibrant, carefree existence. The reality of breaking a generational cycle is far less cinematic. When you have spent your entire life functioning as the unmeasured variable in someone else's fraudulent scheme, your nervous system becomes wired for constant threat assessment. You learn to read the slight changes in a parent's tone the way a meteorologist reads a dropping barometer. You anticipate the manipulation before the sentence is even finished. Shutting down that internal alarm system takes time. The aftermath of victory does not feel like a sudden burst of happiness. It feels like an echoing silence, I spent my first few weeks in the new apartment learning how to inhabit that silence. I would wake up, brew a cup of coffee, and sit by the window waiting for an impending crisis that never arrived. There were no frantic phone calls demanding cash for imported floral arrangements. There were no passive-aggressive comments about my appearance. There were no neighborhood whispers to navigate. The absence of chaos felt startling at first, almost unnatural. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence transformed into something profound. It became peace. I looked at my life and realized I had finally achieved a zero-variance future. In statistical modeling, zero variance means that all the data points are identical, resulting in absolute predictability. There are no sudden deviations. There are no hidden liabilities waiting to bankrupt the system. My safety was no longer dependent on the whims of a woman who viewed my existence as a line of credit. My ledger was clean. I owned my time, I owned my resources, and I owned my identity. The catering empire Diane built on lies had been liquidated. The social standing she guarded so fiercely had evaporated. She was currently navigating the grueling, humiliating reality of a court-mandated repayment plan, living in a cramped rental unit, and facing a community that now knew exactly who she was behind the cashmere and the pearls. I did not wish her harm, but I also refused to carry her burden. I had closed her account. My name is Iris Palmer. I am 21 years old, and I am going to be an actuary. I measure risk for a living, and I am telling you that the most dangerous liability you can carry is a family member who prices their love according to what you can provide them. If you are listening to this right now and you recognize the math of my childhood in your own life, I need you to hear me. If you are acting as the silent sinking fund for a toxic family, if you are the one quietly paying the emotional and financial debts accrued by people who treat you like a utility, it is time to audit your ledger. They will tell you that family protects family. They will try to sell you a narrative where your sacrifice is a noble obligation. Do not buy the narrative. Look at the baseline data. Look at the history of their actions, not the promises in their apologies. A relationship that requires you to bankrupt your own peace of mind to keep someone else comfortable is not a relationship. It is a hostage situation disguised as a household. You have the power to stop paying the premiums on their mistakes. You do not need to scream, and you do not need to seek revenge. You only need to rely on the facts. Document the truth, draw an unyielding boundary, and step off their balance sheet. The transition will be terrifying and the initial silence will feel heavy, but I promise you the math works out in the end. Walk away from the shadows they cast. Walk into the daylight, build your own fortress, and claim the quiet, steady peace of a zero-variance future. You deserve a life where your safety belongs entirely to you. That is my story. The blueprint of a forgery dismantled by a simple calendar and a college transcript. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from a family member who treated your future like their own personal checking account? How did you finally break the cycle? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If my journey brought you any clarity today, please subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We have a new story of quiet justice waiting for you next week, and it might just be the exact strategy you need to hear. Stay safe, trust your own data, and I will see you in the next one.
We often think of destruction as a loud, violent phenomenon, a sudden storm that tears the roof from a house or a fire that consumes it from the inside out. But as the story of Iris and Diane illustrates, the most devastating collapses are entirely silent. They happen on crisp autumn afternoons over glossy floral catalogs. They occur in the quiet scratching of a silver pen practicing a forged signature on a glass scanner pane. We look at the wreckage of the Palmer family not just as a tale of financial fraud, but as a chilling, profound mirror reflecting the deepest, most uncomfortable truths of modern American parenting. In a culture that fiercely champions traditional family integrity, this story serves as a stark awakening, urging us to examine the foundational roots of how we raise our children through morality, wisdom, and resilience. In American society, particularly within tight-knit communities that revere status and reputation, there is a fierce unspoken race to maintain the perfect facade. The phenomenon of keeping up with the Joneses is not merely a harmless suburban pastime. It can become a psychological trap. A large house with a pristine lawn, imported luxury vehicles in the driveway, and lavish country club weddings are frequently and mistakenly held up as the ultimate barometers of happiness and success. The tragedy of the perfect mask is that when parents become hopelessly attached to this external validation, they inevitably begin to sacrifice their internal reality. Diane is the quintessential embodiment of an ego that has entirely consumed a conscience. She used the sacred concept of protecting the family as a convenient alibi for her own vanity and selfishness. In this toxic paradigm, children cease to be human beings. They are reduced to functional assets on a balance sheet. One daughter becomes a glittering ornament, worn to impress the neighbors, while the other is quietly designated as a liquid reserve fund, waiting to be drained when the applause stops. The most urgent message regarding morality and parenting is the desperate need to return to unconditional love, a love that arrives without a hidden invoice. A parent grounded in true morality recognizes a fundamental, non-negotiable fact: children are not property, nor are they financial safety nets. They are independent individuals, walking their own paths, carrying their own destinies. A mother or father is meant to be a guiding light, not a creditor holding a lien against their child's future. Authentic morality does not reside in the casseroles brought to church bake sales, nor does it live in the practiced diplomatic smiles flashed at Rotary Club dinners. True morality lives in the dark, quiet spaces where nobody else is watching. It lives in the absolute refusal to deceive the people who sleep under your roof and trust you the most. If a business fails, or if the money simply runs out, the moral choice requires looking your family in the eye and admitting defeat. It takes profound integrity to say, "I am struggling, and our lifestyle must change," rather than silently stealing a child's inheritance to camouflage the failure of the past. Wisdom in parenting extends far beyond academic intelligence or the ability to calculate a risk distribution model. Deep spiritual wisdom is the capacity to see through the impermanence of the material world. The community accolades the imported luxury SUVs, the cascading orchids draped over a grand staircase. These are all fragile, transient illusions. They can vanish in the time it takes a notary to stamp a piece of paper. Parents must cultivate the wisdom to recognize that attaching their self-worth to these temporary markers is a guaranteed path to suffering, pulling the entire household into a vortex of debt and moral compromise. Furthermore, wisdom requires a profound understanding of cause and effect. Every action, every manipulation, and every lie inevitably generates a corresponding consequence. Diane sowed seeds of deceit, exploitation, and isolation. Ultimately, she harvested a bitter crop of bankruptcy, public disgrace, and complete loneliness. Wisdom teaches us that leaving a child with a foundation of unwavering truth, even if that truth is steeped in poverty and hardship, is infinitely safer than leaving them a sprawling fortune constructed on shifting sand. Finally, we arrive at resilience, a concept often misunderstood in the context of family preservation. True resilience is not the stubborn, white-knuckled grip required to uphold a flawless public image at all costs. It is not the refusal to sink. Rather, true resilience is the breathtaking courage required to let the mask shatter. It takes a monumental, almost superhuman level of inner strength for a parent to confront their own ruin and admit, "I was wrong. We have nothing left, and we must start over." Had Diane possessed even a fraction of this emotional resilience, she would have lost her catering empire, but her family would have remained intact. We also see the pinnacle of resilience in Iris. Her calm, unshakable boundary setting represents the highest form of internal fortitude. Instead of reacting with screaming rage or desperate pleas, she used stillness and absolute resolve to sever a toxic cycle. Parents, too, must practice this form of resilience. We must have the courage to stop spoiling our children in the wrong ways, as Diane did, by insulating Kelsey from reality, and instead allow them to face the natural friction of life. for it is only through facing hardship that a child truly grows. The overarching lesson for anyone raising a child today is daunting, but liberating. You must repair yourself before you attempt to shape your children. The sturdiest homes in our neighborhoods are not fortified by high-interest loans, elite social standing, or neighborhood gossip. They are built entirely on the quiet, unglamorous bedrock of honesty. We are tasked with leaving our children a legacy of morality, ensuring we live without shame in our own hearts. We must leave them a legacy of wisdom, teaching them to know when they have enough and to understand the inevitable weight of consequence. And we must leave them a legacy of resilience, demonstrating how to walk into the storm on our own 2 feet, rather than hiding behind a carefully painted mask. When parents finally find the courage to light their own torches and walk truthfully in the dark, children will naturally, inevitably find the light. If these reflections resonate with the quiet battles fought behind your own closed doors, or if you have ever had to draw a line in the sand to protect your own future, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe, where we continue to explore the power of quiet strength, the dismantling of toxic facades, and the hard-earned peace that comes when the truth is finally spoken. Ultimately, we are all just building ledgers in the dark, recording our choices day by day. When the final audit comes and the ink dries on the story of your life, will the people you love the most recognize the signature at the bottom of the page, or will they be left wondering who was really holding the pen?